Finding My Name by Michael Kinney. Chapter 6. The Tattoo. By then, I already knew there were different rules for Dad than there were for everyone else. What applied to him didn't apply to us. What he was allowed to do often depended entirely on whether he was the one doing it. We'd moved again, this time into another house in Bell City. My Aunt Melissa and Uncle Melvin had bought it with the understanding that Mom and Dad would eventually pay them back. For a while, life settled into a routine. Not a perfect one, just familiar. Around that time, my friend John and I made what seemed like an excellent decision for two teenage boys. We gave ourselves tattoos. Looking back, it was a terrible idea. At the time, we thought it was the coolest thing we'd ever done. The problem wasn't the tattoo itself. The problem was that I knew exactly what Dad would say. This was a man who spent years tattooing other people. The buzzing machine had been part of my childhood as long as I could remember. But somehow, when it came to me, tattoos were different. One day I tested the waters. I asked Mom and Dad what they'd think if I got a tattoo. One day I tested the waters. I asked Mom and Dad what they'd think if I got a tattoo. Dad didn't hesitate. I'd kick you out in a heartbeat. The answer confused me then, and it still confuses me now. But it also told me everything I needed to know, so I kept mine hidden for months. Then winter arrived. One evening I came home from open gym. The house seemed calm. Mom was standing near the heater. Dad was sitting in his recliner. They were talking and laughing. Nothing looked wrong. Nothing felt wrong. When they asked me to sit down, I didn't think much of it, so I sat. Dad looked at me. "Let me see your ankle." I lifted my right foot. Nothing there. He stared for a second and then nodded. "Now the other one." My stomach dropped. I lifted my left foot onto the table. The tattoo was on the outside of my ankle. I turned my leg so he could only see the inside and covered the rest with my hand. For a second, I thought maybe I'd get away with it. Then Dad smiled. Not a happy smile. The kind that lets you know the game is already over. "Now move your hand." So I did. For a moment, nobody said anything. Dad stared at the tattoo. I stared at him. The room felt smaller than it did a few seconds before. Then he laughed. Not because he thought it was funny, because he thought it was stupid. "That looks like shit." Mom laughed awkwardly beside the heater, the kind of laugh people make when they don't know what else to do. I waited for someone to say something else. I waited for the lecture, the yelling, the punishment. Instead, Dad looked at me and said something far simpler. "Get your shit and get out." At first, I wasn't even sure I heard him correctly. I looked at Mom, not because I expected her to stop him, because I needed someone to tell me this wasn't actually happening. She didn't. She just stood there, laughing nervously, avoiding my eyes. Looking back, I understand she was trapped in ways I couldn't fully see at the time. Back then, all I understood was that nobody was stopping him. So I went upstairs, packed a bag, and left. Just like that. No plan, no destination, no idea what came next. I walked to the laundromat in the middle of town. That became home, at least for a while. First night was cold, colder than I expected. Kind of cold that settles into your bones and stays there. I spent most of the night awake, listening to the machine hum, watching the clock crawl forward, trying to convince myself that morning would come faster if I stared at it long enough. The next day I found Mom and asked if she had any money. I wasn't asking for much, just enough to keep the dryers running. The heat from them was better than sleeping outside. She dug through her purse and handed me $3.75. That was all she had. I don't blame her for that. By then she had spent most of my life carrying bills, and that should have belonged to two adults instead of one. Still, I remember staring at those quarters and loose change in my hand. $3.75. That was the difference between being warm and being cold, being comfortable and being miserable, being a kid and suddenly feeling a lot older than one. From that point forward, my life became a collection of borrowed places, friends' houses, gym locker rooms, couches, spare bedrooms, anywhere someone was willing to let me stay for a night or two. I learned how to travel light because everything I owned had to fit into a bag. I learned how to make myself useful because useful people get invited back. I learned how to pretend I was doing fine because people get uncomfortable when they realize a kid has nowhere to go. Every now and then I'd sneak back into Mom's house. I'd sleep on the couch, eat whatever food I could find, try to pretend for a few hours that things were normal. Sometimes it even worked, until Dad found a reason to remind me why I left. I'd come back, we'd fight, I'd leave again. Then I'd come back and we'd do it all over again. The cycle repeated itself for years. Long enough that it stopped feeling temporary. Long enough that I stopped expecting anything to change. By then, Dad and I weren't really fighting about tattoos or chores or whatever excuse happened to be on the surface. We were fighting about years. Years of anger. Years of resentment. Years of things neither of us knew how to say. The difference was that I was getting older. Bigger. Stronger. Every year he had a little less control than the year before. Every year I got a little closer to leaving for good. When I was 17, I finally found a way out. I joined the Army. A lot of people join because they want adventure. Some join because they want education. Some because they want to serve their country. I joined because I needed an escape. For the first time in my life, the future existed somewhere beyond the next argument, beyond the next eviction, beyond the next time I found myself wondering where I'd sleep. I didn't know exactly what I was running toward. I only knew what I was running from. And after spending most of my childhood trying to survive one man, running felt a lot like freedom.